Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National Book Development Board's Literary and Publishing Trade Conversations, or LitPub Session 5. I'm Samantha Palanca and I will be your host and for the opening and closing parts of this program. So the National Book Development Board, or NBDB, is an attached agency of the Department of Education with the mandate to develop and support the Philippine book publishing industry. LitPub is a series of NBDB videos and discussions that celebrates literature and promotes best practices in publishing trade through discourse on issues, opportunities, and trends in literature, book publishing, and readership. So this session is in partnership with Bookbed, Lira, Linangan sa Imahen, Retorika at Anyo, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, Panitikon.ph, and Prime Trade Asia Incorporated. Before we officially start the discussion, we would just like to lay down some house rules. For our participants, kindly choose a conducive learning environment. As much as possible, avoid unnecessary background noise. Mute your mic at all times, but we encourage everyone to turn their cameras on for this session, especially for the Q&A portion. Kindly send your questions to the chat box and the moderator will be the one to raise them to the speakers during the Q&A portion if you wish to raise your questions. This session will also be live streamed via Facebook page, so kindly feel free to use the comment section for our Facebook viewers. After at the end of the seminar, this is a kind reminder to evaluate the session that will be emailed to you. So for session 5, our literary conversations, we have us, Mr. Paolo Manalo, Mr. Frank Mercado, and Ms. Jeena Marquez to present the panel entitled Invention and Deception.
Hi, welcome to Literary and Publishing Trade Conversations. This is a series brought to you by the National Book Development Board of the Philippines. My name is Frank Mercado and I'm moderating today's topic entitled Invention and Deception. Words that one wouldn't hope to go together. I mean, this title is fascinating to me because to me, invention is a very open, hopeful word, and deception sort of brings an opposite message, one that sort of conceals hope, hides the truth, and promotes ideas that are not true. But you know, as the pandemic surges, so do deceptive means to communicate what matters. The question we'd like to address today is how can writers redeem language from those who have misused it? To help answer this wonderfully important life-saving question are two celebrated and prolific authors in the Philippines, Jeena Rani Marquez, the author of Beyond Words, published in 2011 among many other creative and academic work. Specifically for Jeena's work on Mindanao, she received a Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Award. Currently, she teaches advanced semantics at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. And to join her is Paolo Manalo, the author of the poetry collection entitled Jolography, published in 2003, and the poetry pamphlet E is for Epa, published in 2018. Paolo teaches English, literature, and creative writing at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. I feel honored to be interviewing you guys today. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon
Hi, good
to you both.
afternoon. Magandang
Well, first,
araw.
magandang araw po. First of all, I'm a big fan of yours and of your work. So, and off the bat, when you gave me the excerpt and I read it, I had literal goosebumps. And as you were reading it, I still had that. So, kudos to you guys. And you know what I realized upon reading your masterpieces is that bilingualism and multilingualism is a very significant component in your writing. Do you think for 2020 onwards, this is how contemporary Filipino writers like you would be using language to speak of their truth? Maybe we can start with Jeena.
Yeah, the use of Philippine languages in a literary work written in English. Well, I think different writers have various ways of doing it and for different reasons. I will talk about my own creative process and what you refer to as my truth. My take of point is language studies because that's what's most organic for me. The recognition that words embody concepts and that languages have different ways of organizing these concepts, and therefore certain words that are available in the lexicon of a language may not have correspondences in another language. You know, semanticists have written extensively on the matter of transferability of meaning from one language to another. So for instance, if we conceive of an idea in one language and we attempt to embody that idea using words in another language, there is a probability that the meaning components in the word that we're using are not the same set of meaning components in what would be considered as equivalent or nearest equivalent in another language. Like many Filipinos, I think and speak in three languages. And it's exciting for me to think about ideas in language studies, such as conceptualization in languages, the role of language in the construction of cultural worlds, and culture-specific configurations of concepts as I undertake creative writing projects. So thinking, reading, and talking about language, meaning, language and thought, language and culture, language in the mind is my truth. So in the River of Gold, for instance, you know, before the very first words of that piece were written, the concepts I was thinking about were shame and embarrassment. I didn't think of them in terms of themes, but in terms of meaning bearing linguistic units that belong to a lexicon or the vocabulary of a language. So in that piece, that was my pursuit of truth there, the meaning of what I believe is a salient concept in our culture. It's set in northern Mindanao. It speaks of the myth I grew up with there and the question of what the concept of kaulaw, which is how shame is translated in one of the languages spoken there, could possibly mean to the speech community.
I agree with Jeena. I guess I'm approaching it the same way, but through a different discipline, which is creative writing. And the look at languages, like as you mentioned, yes, bilingualism, and the criticism and geography is always to look at that, the collisions of the two languages I'm proficient with, which is English and then Tagalog. No, in the 2020 edition, which is this one, Jolography Retconned, I do pursue that further, but it's also a project that I've chosen to either to put on hold or to let go on its own. But to me, this idea of working with two languages is to look at the overlaps, and maybe um, the overlaps are where you look at the language, that poetry is actually a language in itself that takes from these different languages that the practitioners are familiar with. So your truth depends on the limits of the languages that you have, for instance.
Mhm.
So if you have more languages, there are more possibilities, more nuances. And so I guess when I started this project back in 2003, a bit naive too, I must say, was to test the limits of my language, how this exploration might work. And then since then, I've worked with, I guess, the more formal concepts of poetry, such as form, tradition, but still finding how these languages work and overlap within these forms. So for instance, in Geography Retcon, I'll have a poem that it's a sonnet. So the first 8 lines, which is the octet, begins in English, but then it attempts to end it in Filipino. No? So it's taglishing the sonnet that way, to see that what kind of truth exists there. In the poem that I read earlier, which is Tapat, you get a similar project, except it's not a sonnet. It's trying to trying to give you the experience of Valentine's Day in the Philippines, and to work with that is to work with also the presence of both languages. So it's also a play on the title, which is Tapatan, no? Tapatan. And then Tapatan here can also be used as ito yung aking pagtatapat. I'm putting the two languages together to tell this kind of truth, to be truthful, to be tapat to you as well. No, if to I guess just to push the meaning of that term. Um, I do remember back as an undergrad, a question that the poetry and translation expert then was asking us is poetry that which is untranslatable, or is
Mm.
poetry that which is translatable? And I guess through the years, maybe a modification of that might be, at least as far as these collections are concerned, poetry is that where you find the overlaps of things that might be or might not be translatable, and that you carry them within the current of poetry. And I guess this kind of idea takes into consideration as well that we have the internet, so anything that people don't know, they can easily look it up. It's very easy to do that. Just to say, when you're watching a series that you like, that's foreign to your culture. Let's say Filipinos watching K dramas, so they'll take their time to try to pick up particular words, particular nuances that seem important in that language, and they won't wait for the drama or the character to explain this. They'll just continue. So it's this particular, I guess it's in this particular mode, or it's in this particular spirit, which I try to work out the poems.
So, so what's interesting is the fact that when you said that if you're using two languages or more as writers, there are more nuances to it, and hence it becomes more truthful. The art, or the piece, the work of art, the masterpiece becomes more truthful. Based on your observation as writers, how has language been used for deliberate misinformation by other writers?
I think
Yeah.
what we've observed since in 2016, what some critics mark it as, the start of the post-truth era, a
Mm.
term we're
Yeah.
still trying to work around with its definitions. But this whole idea that um, when certain people who wield a certain amount of power, whether they're influencers, whether they're world leaders, um, choose to just um, present particular statements, and then when the statements are proven to be false, they then work on the whole idea that, well, this isn't deception. This is actually our way of being creative with the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to be touching on principles of creative writing here. That's why I figure creative writing teachers are are upset by this kind of development, is that their discipline is being used as a way for, the reason why we have these inaccuracies, these things that we call fake news, is because of the fictions that are created by creative writing.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's where the problem lies in creative writing. It's very clear that genres dictate the need for a kind of distance, a kind of, in order to tell the truth has to be told within this fictional world that's actually created, right? In that sense. um, but what these leaders are trying to do is, they're policymakers, and they're using these tactics to obfuscate possible deceptions that happen when they're caught. When they're caught to do this. So things, for instance, that we hear, oh, you're taking this person's word too seriously. That was meant as a joke, okay? But
Mm.
it's different when the joke is found, say, in a comedy club, where that's exactly what you expect, right? But on the world stage, this is different, because any pronouncements made there affect policy, affect lives, and you shouldn't joke around it. So again, it also becomes, I mean, the simplest way to address this is, it all is a matter of context here. It's all a matter of, okay, what's being presented here. If you're a world leader, are you trying to tell a story this way? No, what you're doing is, you're using what storytellers are using as an excuse to excuse, I guess, um, your your actions that are now proved to be questionable. I guess maybe Gina, you can help me here, no, with these particular ideas.
Yes,
I
Jeena.
agree with you that truth telling and the use of literary devices to do it are not exclusive. You can tell the truth in a story you made up. And the word fiction has more than one sense. I think confusion comes from a conflation of some of its significations. On one hand, the word may refer to that which is false, and it is used in opposition to truth. You know, as in the fragment, the fiction that all is well in their neighborhood. On the other hand, the word refers to literature in this form, fiction, and used it to distinguish it from poetry or nonfiction or drama. You know, fiction in this sense is not at all opposed to truth. You know, what is imaginary may be the truest thing in the life of the person imagining it. I think the stories we enjoy, no matter where they're set, you know, whether they're based on objective reality or a projection of that reality, speak of truth when the writer chooses to speak of his or her truth. What enables us to conceive of truth? I mean, the very notion of truth. Where does that come from? You know, what enables us to even conceive of it? And I find this interesting when you speak more than one language because you can conceive of it in different ways, in more than just one way. You know, I think this is one of the things that I find most exciting when I use more than one language to speak of something. You know, because then I can think about how something is conceptualized. The word for truth, tinuod, in Binisaya, you know, can refer to something real and something true.
Now, I've read excerpts of your work, and I must say they made me feel like I stepped into a time space machine to actually transport me to a place where I recognize. I mean, I haven't been to Mindanao at all, and but I felt I was there. And for Paolo too, it took me back to 1998 Valentine's Day. But I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I guess for now, it's time to actually, for the benefit of our viewers, to, if you could indulge me, please, to read excerpts of your work. Maybe we could start with Paolo and then next with Jeena.
I'll read a poem from, not from Jolography Retconned, but from Happily Ever Ek Ek. So this contains more or less more love poetry. So the poem I've chosen is called Tapat. It's on that special day in February that people are familiar with, whether they celebrate it or not. Tapat. You're thinking 3 for 200 is too much for something worth 20 pesos each on a regular day. But nothing about today is regular. Not with chocolates, balloons, stuffed toys before tonight's dates. Not when everyone buying flowers must buy before everyone else. Some might say to give today is better because you pay buo for something that's not just the way you would last week or tomorrow. Hindi binabarya ang pag-ibig, as my suki would say. 4 years now, he buys always on this date, like all the rest of the love struck who find it hard to say how they really feel. That's why the redness of the rose is here. The flowers come to you fresh, and you deliver fresh, as the love you had the day the beloved became your love. And for that, no tawad. That's it.
Now, next, let's talk about Gahom, presented to us by Jeena.
I'll be reading an excerpt from Gahom, which is from Mindanao Harvest 4.
When the boy Ikoy woke up that morning, the heralds of death were marching through the town where he lived, which had turned into a mess of men and women scurrying for cover. The air he breathed was growing thicker by the minute, so heavy with disquiet he couldn't see what was before him, except for tanks casting long shadows on paved paths and soldiers in khakis carrying bayonets for skewering babies. Ikoy's family had to hide far from the crackles of rifles that rang through the town. They trekked through a jungle to live in the mountains, a refuge from the cacophony of screams and flying bullets that awakened the sleepy town every day. The boy tried to amuse himself by going out into the shallow lake to watch the prawns go wild. He was squatting by the lake to pester the prawns, and as he got up to get a tree branch, besieged by a familiar uneasiness, a quivering of his insides he had felt many times before. Before his family moved to the mountains, Ikoy's life had revolved around the church in the town where his father had met his mother. When he was a toddler, he would spend his days inside the grand edifice of saints. One day, while he was inside the church, he felt an invisible force beat against his body. Ikoy's head hurt terribly, and then he fell on the floor. In his secret haze of pain, Ikoy could hear voices saying, "Hey, there's a boy who fainted in there!" They asked him what had happened, but no one believed his tale of strong winds and loud noises. Neither would anyone believe that he did see Señor San Vicente and Señor San Roque descend the altar and go to him when he plunged into the darkness. The priest scolded him. "Ayaw pamot-bot, magsulti kas tinuod pag naa ka simbahan." Don't lie. Speak the truth when you're inside the church. He couldn't understand why he was accused of lying, when all he did was talk about the images he believed he saw were walking down from their pedestals. Ikoy's parents brought him to a shaman named Dalino, who looked into Ikoy's eyes and told his parents, "Agoy, kining bataan ni doulunon man sa panuway." Oh no, this kid attracts spirits. Ikoy, even as he was deprived of the chance to go to school, believed he possessed sharp powers of reason he expected those around him to quickly dismiss. The boy was stunned to hear the diagnosis. How could they have been spirits when they were saints? Up in the mountains, by the shallow lake, the boy recognized that same feeling of agitation he had felt before each fainting spell, a perplexing anxiety that washed over him before the thunder and winds came. As he got up from his spot near the rock where the prawns were hiding, he saw someone sitting in front of him. Ikoy was certain the being he saw was God.
Wow, these are wonderful pieces of writing. So let's start off with Gahum. I went back to the dictionary, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I found out that Gahum is a Cebuano word that means power. So what was your intention for choosing the title?
As I said earlier, language studies is the starting point in my creative writing. It's not only a transition point, but also a point of confluence. And that is what is organic and real in the way I think and the way I write. So,
should I pronounce it like the book in the Bible, which is Nahum? So Gahum.
no, Gahum.
No, but this is actually a Cebuano word, right? So I said, what does it mean? And then I realized it meant power. So I said, oh, power. So it has to be, said with more emphasis. So maybe it's Gahum.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because that illustrates the point. What's going on there when you saw the word, and this is not a language that you speak, and you were focused on the sound and the meaning of the word. Whereas if it were a language that you speak, your mind focuses on the idea generated by language.
Yeah.
So when we don't think about what we read, we get to notice more when we think about what language is doing in the sensory input, which in this context is a piece of writing. So I find your response interesting, and that might be just one of the reasons why a title like that was chosen.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about redemption of language, Paolo, and do you feel that redemption is in that intention of yours when you were writing Tapat?
Yeah, kind of redemption there, like which is, I guess, to take and to concentrate on language, not just to take it for granted, especially in poetry, I think, and especially in this kind of poetry that uses more than one language, where you're trying to give more attention and emphasis to the language, not just to the meaning, but as Jeena mentioned, even just to the sounds of it, like tapat, how does that feel when you say it, no? And then what does that mean? So to work with these nuances, not to try to confuse the the reader, or try to hide a particular truth which is being done when you're obfuscating policy, for instance.
Mhm.
But maybe what I should do is maybe just share the prompt here. So a colleague said, Valentine's Day is fast approaching. Have you ever tried writing a poem about Valentine's Day, not to mock it, but actually to look at it and to see why it's important, what's why it might become important? And I said, well, that's a challenge because usually it's just easy to mock all these lovers who go through the ritual, right? The ritual of buying flowers as such. So I decided I would take all that, but not mock it, but to actually try to see it through language, through the use of concept now of tapat, now, which can mean not just to be the truthful lover, ako ay tapat na mangingibig sa'yo,
Uh-oh.
but also ito na yung presyong tapat when you're talking about haggling, right? Like I want the last price for that. Well, tapat na to. This is it. Take it or leave it. This is the truth of it. This is what it means.
I got
And
that.
and I guess to try to look at it as tapat also, as you can think of it as an alignment, a correspondence that Jeena was talking about between languages, like tatapatan. I said, how can I do that without it being a lecture on language? And how can I do that on the pedestrian level, because that's the dramatic situation of it. Someone just goes to a flower market that you find in the street that usually, pops up during Valentine's Day, and then just buys flowers.
Uh-oh.
So the context is also very informal in this way. And yet you're taking all these truths and saying, how do I do that? Well, say it with flowers, say it with chocolates, and say it with such, and then hope that it it blends that way. And that's, I think, what I mean by this is the kind of creativity that we have. It's a creativity backed up by imagination. But also, I would argue, especially now, post 2016, I think we should emphasize compassion.
Mhm.
Compassion, I think, for instance, when we use nuances of language, we're doing this not to confuse, but because we have compassion. Compassion for language, our love for language, and our love also for others who may not share our own sense of language, but we want to because this is how we as writers love, in this particular way. Compassion when it comes to metaphor. Now, metaphors not to disrupt or to use harsh language. For instance, you don't want to think of the pandemic as a kind of war. No, it's not a war against the virus. But if you treated it compassionately, you would understand that this is not a war, but rather this is the time for us to reflect, to be able to try to save everyone. So it's a way. Creative writing is also a way of ourselves thinking about the metaphors that we use, as well as the metaphors that other people use. So to work on it that way.
Yeah, and I think compassion is born out of a negotiation that has already happened in the brain or in the psyche between realities and yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And I like the term that Frank uses here, no, negotiation, because that brings it back to what or how I think of poetry as a negotiation of several things, not just language. And in the poem Tapat, that whole negotiation, which is actually haggling for, so how much are these flowers worth to you? Like, what's the final price? No, ano yung tapat na presyo na? It comes out of this whole negotiation, as though to talk about the creative process works that way. So what's the final project will depend on a negotiation, for instance, of one's own skill, of the different languages. And and what we see here is these may all happen. No? So these are all uh, part of a, you can think of it as one whole complex process or several complex processes happening. But I guess for the teachers or the students who are interested in watching this, I through the years, I figured that discipline with the foundations of, say, writing. It goes back to before you can actually individualize and look at for your voice, for your style, for your own way of maybe code switching, even if that's part of your language, is to work with the foundations as well of writing, meaning um, what what may be important depending on the genre. For instance, clarity of thought, no, like um, ways of describing, looking at observing the form or maximizing a particular form, um, working with the whole momentum or the whole tempo of a particular art, you know, whether it's verbal or whether it's written, because this will help make the process seamless so that it doesn't show na you know, I can see the I can see the author's hand, or I can see the author struggling here to decide. But you know, if you do have the discipline, then it becomes and the rigor is there. The work shows, if that's the intention, of course, it's just to be seamless, as though wala lang, you know, this is just an ordinary day. But then when you close read it, this is so complex. Like for instance, what Jeena wrote, Gahum, so many complex things happening here. But then we're brought there, no? Almost gently brought to this kind of truth of
Yeah.
what the boy believed to be, or what the boy then saw.
Yeah. I've been told I've got two books. Tapat is from Paolo's book Happily Ever Ek, and Gahom is from Gina's anthology Beyond Words. Gina and Paolo, would you like to promote where they can get the book? Yeah.
I'm on Twitter at Paolo Manalo, and I think there's a Facebook author page for me. I'm not on Facebook. And then the books are available happily. Jolography Retconned is from the University of the Philippines Press, so you can find that on Lazada and on Shopee. Happily Ever Ek Ek, yeah, Happily Ever Ek Ek, this one is available from independent bookstores as well, like Solidaridad in Manila, Ruel's Bookshop in Quezon City, um, what am I forgetting? Savage Mind in Naga, Mount Cloud in Baguio, so far are the ones where you can get those. You can order from them, or you can order from me through Twitter.
Gina?
Well, Gahum is in a collection called Mindanao Harvest 4. This book here. This is edited by Jaime Ann Lim, Christine Godinez Ortega, and Ricardo de Ungria. I believe it's available online. Beyond Words with the Cultural Center of the Philippines Bookshop used to be available in some fully booked branches. I hope we can all read at a time like this.
So we're encouraging everyone to write. Filipino writers, we need you. The world needs you. To the end of our discussion. So I'm Frank Mercado, and this has been Literary and Publishing Trade Conversations. So until next time, thank you.
Thank you.
I guess we can start the discussion. If you guys picked up anything from the conversations so far, let me check the chat room. What's happening in here? No questions yet, but I guess we can start off with a show of hands. But I can only see your profile pictures. You're also young. Who are writers here, and who have already published? How do I know if they raised their hands? Give us more examples. Can you give us more examples of recent press conference or news articles that use language deceptively? This is from Jason. Would you like to answer that, Jeena? It's unfortunate. Yeah, it's unfortunate because Paolo couldn't join us due to the storm. He couldn't connect to the internet, which is, I guess, the frustration that we all share. So in terms of that kind of language of connecting to the internet, we all share that. But yes, Jeena.
There's another question there that I'd like to address. You'd look at it. Do you want to read it?
Is it the what practices can you share?
Yeah.
What practices can you share for us to improve our vocabulary?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think the first thing we need to do is to make a distinction between active vocabulary and potential vocabulary. So some of the words that we know, we recognize when we read. And this is why we encourage everyone to keep on reading different kinds of things. So when we recognize it, we know what it means. That's part of our what we call our potential vocabulary. It may not necessarily, the particular word may not necessarily be a part of our active vocabulary. So when we speak or when we write, we probably don't use those words. So what we want to do is to increase not just our potential vocabulary, but our active vocabulary. And this we do when we read and we encounter a word and we want to get to the meaning of the word. The dictionary is not the only source for understanding what the word means. You may also look at context clues. You look at how the word is used by the writer. And then what we need to do is to incorporate it. If it's a word that's relevant to our lives, to the way we represent reality, to the way we perceive what we see around us, then we can incorporate that word and make it a part of our vocabulary. And that's one very good way of increasing it. And we can do this in more than one language, which is why I think it's wonderful. We live in a country such as ours where where the linguistic landscape is really interesting. So we can read in different languages, and we want to see more writers using many of our languages in our country in their writing.
Well, I used to live in Singapore for 15 years, and one of my colleagues there was German, and he really wanted to speak Tagalog. So he said, what better way to learn Tagalog but to get a girlfriend, get a Filipino girlfriend, right? So he eventually got a girlfriend and then got married to a Filipino girl in Singapore. And then he's so amazed by the word echuserang frog. Echuserang frog. And so he was explaining the context of echuserang, and then he keeps on using it. And said, this is Germans are very fascinated with German language is a very specific language. So we have words for the song that you keep on hearing. It's called Ohrwurm, right? And so, and for him, it's like mixing two languages, which is Echusera, which is not even a language. I mean, it's a gay lingo, right? And then frog, which is an English word, and which means, I think it meant something like a person that is too nosy, and that's because you're too nosy, you're already very annoying and ugly to me, something like that. Is that correct?
We are very creative in the way we use language. We also see those portmanteau words in our own languages. For instance, in Binisaya, you have a word, istorbot, which I find really interesting. It's flip for istoryang binotbot. Okay, if you remember in the story that I read, the priest was telling the boy, ayaw pamotbot, don't tell lies. But if you examine the use of the word, it's used in more than just one way. And I think that's just a fun way of conceptualizing, casual conversations between friends. We would refer to it as istorbo, which is also a portmanteau and a blend in our language.
I remember being, in our writing class back in elementary school. I obviously had very strict teachers. it's an American Baptist school, and we couldn't really code switch. Code switching is like when you, our rule was then was, if you write in English, write in straight English, and if you write in Tagalog, write in Tagalog. Is that the same thing that we experience now with you younger ones? Or do you feel that right now we're more open to even putting in 2 or 3 more languages in a writing piece?
Well, if we listen to the way we use language, we code switch a lot. We use it all the time. This is part of our reality. It's our linguistic reality. We code switch.
Yeah, it's
because we
even
speak,
Galen.
yeah, we speak more than one language. Some of us speak 3, so we use them in creative ways, and we're comfortable just switching between languages.
So according to Samantha, please, you may not, for all the audience, I know you have brewing questions there. You may turn on your camera for this Q&A. Don't be shy. You can show your faces. But let's move on. Some of the questions, I'm not skipping over your questions, but some are hard. Let's say, because on the deception part, I think this should be addressed by Paolo, but he's not here, right? But we'll try to address them if we can. Can you give examples of books that you think use deceptive languages?
What I can do is talk about the concept of intentionality. I think it's a very important part of understanding the language of deception. Okay, so when you approach a text and you want to examine it closely and you want to see, what the writer is trying to do, what needs to be examined, it's not just the language, but the way it's used to deceive. And when we do that, we examine intentionality, because that makes a difference between something which is really deceptive and something which is not. When a person may say, use language and inadvertently say something false, that's not necessarily deception. But when the intent is really to deliver a false statement, then it's deception. And the philosopher John Searle gave us a very good model in understanding communicative acts, that we don't just look at the semantic significance of an utterance. We don't just look at what something means, what a sentence means. We examine a sentence in an abstract level, but we also look at, people using the language. There's a speaker and there's a listener. And words also perform actions. This is the great insight by Searle. And there's another level there, the level of elocution. What is the statement doing? You're not just saying something, it's also doing something. Are you really promising something, right? Are you claiming something? Are you organizing something by what you're doing, right? And then there is, of course, the other side of the communicative act, and Searle refers to this as the perlocutionary force of the utterance, And when we try to manipulate that, when a writer tries to manipulate the effect on the reader and to use it to deceive, that's when deception happens. When you want to say something that is false, and you expect the reader or the listener to believe it.
Well, deception is can be used as a linguistic tool to sort of speak of the truth of the character in a piece, right? But it has to still be, at least the general rule is, and I don't know if we take ethics for writers, right? But I remember when I was taking my CFA, which is a chartered finance course, the first subject is ethics. And this actually speaks of the ground rules of what a chartered financial analyst should be doing. And, and what rules of engagement a person should be doing before you actually get into the practice of CFA. But I'm not sure with writers, do we have do you think we should start with ethics and then say that, hey, you cannot use writing, you cannot be a writer if you deceive. Well, we're gonna take your license out. You don't have a writing license anymore.
Well, we believe that we want to write with freedom. Freedom is very important to us. And we want to speak our truth. And, you know, readers, we believe readers are intelligent. They can perceive, you know, complexity. So we don't believe that, you know, we should have forces that would coerce us to write in a certain way.
So there are some writers here, I guess, writers in the room. From Cedric J, what other techniques of language play or wordplay can we use in writing creatively? Language play.
Oh yeah, there's so many. You can listen to how people use language and you see, you know, how creative people can be. One is to examine words that have multiple meanings, okay? So we call them polysemous words. Now you can really play with that. I think that's one of the things that Paolo did in his poem, right? Tapat can mean more than one thing. And he maximized the ambiguity there. You know, when you want to explain something, you may want to disambiguate the meaning of the word, which is what we did earlier when we talked about fiction used in more than one sense. But in creative writing, you can play with all of these ambiguities. All right. And I think if we read Paolo's work, you'll see a lot of that happening. We can also use blends, which we find in our discourse, right? You can get a word and with an idea, and then another word with another idea, and put them together. The example I gave you was the use of estorbot, and this occurs naturally in language, but in creative writing, we can make use of that playfulness and use it to say what we want to say.
I think I don't know if you guys are writing about writing pilots, you know, TV pilots. But if you've been watching Netflix, The Crown, see episode 3, they talked about. I think one scene there was Princess Margaret went to the Philippines and got a chance to speak with Imelda Marquez. And they said, so did she show her shoe collection? No, it's interesting, she said. It's not a shoe collection, but a seashell collection. Maybe you just misheard because she's Filipina, so it should be, maybe she said shoe. So they played with the sound of how we say shoe and shell could be the same. So probably that's why she misunderstood it. So, I mean, things like this you can use creatively as well to put humor, maybe to criticize a character in your piece.
Yeah, when we understand the structure of language and the system of language, we see that we can study it in different ways and in different levels. So you were talking about sound. So there is a field called phonology. It's a systematic study of the sound system of a language. You can explore many ways by which you can play with the sounds of a language in its phonological forms. And then there is also what we call morphology. And we can look at how words are formed and built, and you can also play with that. And there's syntax, all right? The syntactic structure, the grammatical structure of a language. You can also use wordplay and creative uses of playing with the syntactic structure of a language. Right? Our syntactic structures are distinct. For instance, when we construct a sentence in Filipino, we usually begin with a verb, right? BSO. But when we think of an idea in English, we usually begin with, so when we say subject, so SVO. Now, if you want to, play around with that, that's also something you can do. And then, of course, there is the semantic structure of a language. Now, this is my favorite part, and this is where I really use creativity. It's the meaning structure and the meaning system of a language. So there are different, approaches to wordplay, if that's what you want to do.
Another example would be using I think a sentence structure that aligns with, let's say, if you want to depict a character. I think it was Crazy Rich Asians, where a certain Chinese rich family was not accepted in the hotel to check in, right? And so, but they were speaking Chinese. It was raining, and they were speaking Chinese because it was raining, and they're comfortable in Chinese. And then, but suddenly, they were not accepted by the guys because he said, "Hey, this is only for you're not the demographic for this hotel. You're Chinese for the British." So she spoke. Then after that, she code switched into straight Queen's English. So you can do that too in your writing. You can play with that this person is a multilingual person, but he's of a different class.
It's interesting that you brought up that example. It illustrates, narratives that people have about other people or about certain groups of people. And you see that, the people in that scene already had narratives about this group of people, and you can see that in the way they responded to her using this particular language. And this is how powerful languages are. I mean, I think we have the responsibility to really use it, knowing that how we use it may shape perceptions, and perceptions about certain groups of people, especially.
Now, let's move on to criticisms. Are there criticisms that we see from using ambiguities of language used in writing?
Well, it depends on the context. As I was saying earlier, in creative writing, we maximize ambiguities because we enjoy it. We derive aesthetic pleasure from maximizing, the possibilities of where these ambiguities can take us, right? But if the context is, as I said earlier, a point of explanation, for instance, what you would want to do is to disambiguate, is to clarify, how meanings may differ even when you use the same word. In English, you find a book of homonyms, so many words that have multiple meanings and polysemous words. It's a very important area in semantics, the study of polysemy. So it depends on the context, right? In creative writing, we love to play with language and to use it creatively, which is why we might want to, play with the reader's perception of what a word can possibly mean in this particular context. Mahal is a word in Filipino which can refer to love, and it can also refer to expense, right?
Yeah.
And that's something you can play with in this context.
I guess a criticism would. Oh yeah, continue.
When I was working for the Supreme Court, for instance, I had to disambiguate, certain words, because what matters there is clarity. We need to be clear about the things that we say. So in this particular context, disambiguation is more important than maximizing ambiguity.
I guess for me, for lovers, you might want to be more disambiguous with your words, to convey love, for instance, right? You can say your mahal should only be mahal instead of it's expensive. Otherwise, it would cause fights between lovers. But I think criticisms would also be, I think when I remember Paolo was mentioning that the criticism is when you meant it as a joke, but in a context that is not comedy, for instance. And you're a policymaker. and you have to, and people, millions of people depend on what you write for decisions in their lives. That's something that you have to go against. You have to always be truthful and write the truth. Speaking of truth, from Jose Gan, as writers, do you believe the universality of truth despite our differences from culture, religion, etc.?
That's a very interesting question. And this is one of the most important things we talk about when we study semantics. The idea of universality, and are these concepts really universal? But I think we need to make a distinction between just the idea of truth and the conception of truth, how it's conceptualized and how it's conceived.
Mm-hmm.
I already gave you an example of the differences between how it's conceived in a particular language, where the word may refer to reality and truth. But in English, you will see that these are two different concepts. We don't use the word true to refer to something which is real. So when we speak of gold, for instance, we don't say that gold is true, we say that the gold is real. But when you conceive of it in another language that uses just one word to refer to that which is real and to that which is true, then the word that will be used is that word, which is tinood. So you can actually say tinood na Bulawan, right? So this tells us, this is the linguistic evidence for relativity, that you see that, people conceive of concepts in different ways. And some of the things that we think are universal are already put in question. The universality is put in question. You see this in the work of Rizbishka, a semanticist. For instance, fear, many people think it's universal, just the emotion of fear. But how is it conceived? Where does that idea come from? The very notion of being afraid. And if you examine different languages, you may actually find different conceptions of it expressed in the words that embody the concepts. So we really have various ways of perceiving reality. And this is why it's so exciting to do this in our country, because there are so many languages to examine.
Well, Paolo is actually with us on chat, and he has an answer for the criticism, I think. He says, in writing workshops, what we usually find are unintended ambiguities by the writer because language is not used with precision or clarity, or the writing becomes vague because a term or phrase may refer to too many ideas without explanations or clarifications from the writer. So that's one criticism. Yes, I agree with Jeena on, truths and how it represents a part of your experience as well, right? And so big T is a very difficult thing to answer, as in like everyone agrees on one T. I guess even in death, for instance, because they said there are only two things that are sure, right? Death and taxes. But I think even for some people, death isn't sure, right? And some don't pay taxes. So do you feel that because the Philippines is made of different cultures, there is a need for writers to write more so that we actually know more truths that are existing in our nation called the Philippines?
As I said earlier, we value freedom. And we have the freedom to write about what we believe in. We may believe in different things, but we have that freedom to proclaim what we believe in. And we may examine various conceptions of belief and truth as well. So some people may believe that, there are fundamental truths, and that these are built on unshakable foundations. And they have the freedom to believe that. Some people don't believe that. Some people do not believe in the existence of anything absolute, and they have the freedom to believe that as well. And they also have the freedom to use writing to speak of what they believe in.
I think for the discussion of truth as well, I mean, among people of different players, of autonomous players in the Philippines, I think what should be what should be non-negotiable would be that for us to be able to have a platform to negotiate, I think, for different truths, and that when do we say acceptance of other people's truths, or do we say I think acceptance, right? That you have your own truth that you have to write about, and you have to write it, you have to make people know truth too. So universality of truth, that's right. Do you believe? Yeah, I mean, personally, I do believe in the universality of truth, but I think we should be able to negotiate, have a platform to negotiate on how we define truths. So the question is actually being answered by a text. So thank you, Kate, for that clarification. What can you say about people? This is from Jason Vega. What can you say about people, especially those in the minority, creating their own language, like the gay speak, the sword speak, and the recent Jejemon language?
Oh, yes,
honestly, I don't know what sword.
But we find this, and it's an exciting phenomenon. We certainly encourage, the development of languages and varieties of language. And it may start out as covert language, to build solidarity among us, a small group of people, but then it goes into the mainstream, and we encourage, people being creative with the way language is used. We don't believe that language has to be static. It is so dynamic. And we also believe that as people who study language, we don't have to be prescriptive. We examine language as it is used by the speakers in a speaking community. Pinapakinggan natin yan. We listen to how people are using, language. We don't say, okay, this is the only way to use it. We want people to explore ways, because our reality changes. And when the reality changes, we will need, new ways of expressing what we find in that reality, and to represent not just linguistic reality, but extra linguistic reality. So yes, we find the use of language like that to be an exciting development. We don't believe that a particular language has to be monolithic, right? Like we celebrate what we call Englishes, world Englishes. We don't want to see English as a monolithic entity. We just, this is English and this is how it should be used. We see that people in different parts of the world are using it in different ways, and we celebrate that.
Yeah. I lost my track of thought there. I had something to say, but let's move on first to another question from Jason. Once again, is this an expression on the part of these minorities to speak truth to their experience, to turn the conversation on themselves, to crave out an existence for themselves, to carve out an existence for themselves? I guess that's my insight actually, because Jeena mentioned a while ago about shame and embarrassment, and I felt like the writer is usually shy. I don't know if you feel the same way, but at least in Hollywood, if you are going to write and not being the star of your own show, then you're probably very, very shy. But actors don't actually write. So during the time when there's a writer's boycott, everything in Hollywood that goes out were good quality acting, but the writing was just really, really bad. So the storyline was really bad. So I feel like it's indicative of freedoms that are now actually being more introduced and more apparent in our society, and that's why we are allowing people, or we're actually seeing more pieces written in gay speak, or even in Jejemon, or I don't know what Jejemon is actually and what sword is, but maybe in the future we can actually have a book totally written in gay speak, or maybe we already have. or a dictionary in gay speak as well, or in Jeju.
Yes, let me address that from the perspective of my writing, which is in this story is set in northern Mindanao. You know, when people are belittled by virtue of their locus of existence or the way they sound, you know, we want to use the power of language to perhaps reshape perceptions about a certain group of people. This is probably one of the reasons many more writers from this part of our country are writing really with strong voices, saying, you know, this is our experience in this part of the country, and this is our reality, and we are speaking of this reality from our perspective.
Well, for the piece Gahom, for instance, I mean, I'm not, as I've told people in the video, that I'm not from Mindanao, but I felt like I actually sort of have the same experiences as this boy Ikoy, when he said, you know, hey, I think he was being belittled by being young, and that whatever he says is actually a lie by someone in authority. And for me as a kid, I mean, that's when I grew up. It's like, you know, don't talk back to your parents, and your opinion may not count, more likely will not count because you're still young. And I think as writers, this is what our role is. You know, you to sort of bring that out, bring that message out, and get readers to be represented in their piece and get their truths out there.
Yeah, Frank, you know, that character was certain that he was capable of rational thought. He knew. He actually really uttered it. He said, you know, that despite his lack of education because of the war, he knew that he was intelligent, he was capable of rational thought.
Yeah.
Which was why that was, you know, also how he responded to people dismissing his story.
And let's move on to the next question, which is, can you, this is interesting. Can you, from Bernard Luis Pantoja, can you incorporate ambiguity with truth or vice versa without making it sound paradoxical?
Again, I would ask, you know, in what context. If it's in the context of creative writing, that's one of the things that writers enjoy doing, is to, you know, hide elements of truth in their writing, to use indirection, not misdirection, but indirection. We enjoy, you know, burying clues in a piece of writing so that the reader may excavate this truth and see this truth for themselves, you know. So that may be a strategy there, to use ambiguity, but still speak of the truth, right? And I would still welcome paradox. If it turns out to be a paradox, I would still find that really interesting. It's still something that a curious mind would enjoy grappling with. So if it turns out to be a paradox, then that's still something I would enjoy as a reader. If I were to read a piece which incorporates ambiguity as a strategy to speak of truth, and it turns out to be a paradox, then it would still be an interesting paradox, what I think.
It has to be based on facts, and that's why I think the home was based out of your conversations. You actually went into the field and had actual conversations with was it the shaman there, the local shaman, and that's why you wrote the truth as it is.
Yes, it's a piece of nonfiction.
Yeah.
So I was listening to him and representing even his linguistic reality, the things that he was saying during the time that I sat with him. But after I wrote the piece, I found out that my friend's grandfather is very similar to the character in that piece. You know, he was also referred to as gamhanan, someone who's gamhanan, someone who possesses power and supernatural strength and all that. So it's really so much a part of our reality in our part of Mindanao.
Another question from Camille Ann. With a freedom on beliefs and truths, does this mean that we will give all the responsibility of interpreting the piece or word to the readers? If this happens, what now becomes the role of the writer? If otherwise, how should the writer limit the reader's perception?
Okay, there are various schools of thought to address this. It depends, of course, on what you subscribe to. One way of looking at it is to see meaning as a communicative act. If it is a communicative act, you have a speaker and you have a listener. Therefore, the author there is not dead yet. The author is still a speaking subject, and the author has something to say. Therefore, the reader will then be looking for the speaker meaning, not just the utterance meaning, but the speaker meaning. Okay, the utterance meaning may be distinct from the speaker meaning, right? So if you examine, let's say, the meaning of a sentence, you may examine it as, you may examine the sentence and recognize it as an abstract entity. You know, it is abstract. But when it becomes an utterance, then it has physical form. Like right now, I'm transmitting vocal signals. These signals then turn into a verbal message. We're trying to say something. So if that is your perspective, what you will be looking for there is the meaning in the text, right? But if you believe that the author is no longer a speaking subject and that meaning is indeterminate, then you will no longer be looking for that. And you can then say, okay, I will impose my will on this text. And if this is what I want it to mean, then this is what it means for me. And these are two different ways of looking at it.
That is interesting because in America, let's say when something is going on, like a power relation, a power pressure coming from the top, let's say a boss sexually oppressing an underling, for instance, they said, you know, to object means would mean that you have to utter your word, you have to voice your objection, because otherwise it won't be real. You have to call the act, call it, you know, and say it. So yeah, from being abstract, when you utter something, it becomes real.
Yeah, so you may have one sentence, like the sentence you just spoke, which is generated by you at this moment. Now, if somebody repeats that exact sentence that you just spoke, then it may be the same sentence, but not the same utterance, right? So it then becomes another utterance, and that utterance dies in the wind. You know, it's a different entity. And that may actually have another meaning. So you may have the same sentence, all right, and still bear different meanings for different people who use them, you know, depending on their intention. So if I say, for instance, it's hot, right, I may mean something by it. Of course, there is meaning in the level of a sentence. You can look at that in terms of its grammatical structure and its semantic structure and what that means. But if you, Frank, for instance, then say again, it's hot with a different intention and you want it to do something. Let's say you want somebody to turn an electric fan on, right? So then it means something else. It doesn't mean that the temperature is high. It can mean, will you please turn the electric fan on?
Yeah. I think my dad grew up. For instance, my dad grew up in an old town in Pampanga, and he would ask me when I was young, "Bakit may platito dyan?" Which also means that, hey, put some sauce in the platito, because the platito is empty, you know. But things like this, where we have a time, I don't know, a time and age difference. I wouldn't understand what he meant. So,
Inuutusan ka na pala, hindi mo pa
inutusan ka na
alam.
pala, yeah. Bakit merong platito dyan? And I was like, to put sauce in. So, from Jose Gan, he said, "Thank you for answering. The reason that I brought up the question, I think as writers, speaking of truth, something that will make us all better is a must, despite individual differences, lest misunderstanding will always haunt." So true, ma'am. Language is dynamic and varied.
Indeed, yes, I totally agree with you. And misunderstanding is also an interesting phenomenon in language use. Um, we begin with an idea in our head, right, before we say something. So, and this happens very fast. That's how fascinating language is. And with that idea in our head, we then choose words, right? We choose certain symbols to represent that idea in our head. And then we transmit those symbols either in the form of writing or in through vocal signals, which is what's happening right now in our interaction. And then that is then transmitted, and you have, in this context, several listeners. But then that will have to be decoded, right? And then the listeners will then form ideas in their minds about what's being said. Now, what happens when the idea in the speaker's mind is not exactly the same as the idea in the listener's mind, right? Or the intention may be perceived as something different, right? Then there's a breakdown in communication there. And this happens all the time in our linguistic reality. We wonder why the response, or what Searle calls the perlocutionary effect, is not what we expect. Let's say you want to say something nice to somebody, and you use certain words to express that thought, and then that person gets offended by a compliment, and you wonder, that was a compliment, why was this person offended? Because then there's a breakdown in communication. The idea generated by you is not the same idea decoded by the listener. Now you can just imagine in writing, when you don't get immediate feedback, whereas in a verbal and a vocal transmission of signals, in a verbal interaction such as this one, we get to see feedback. We see the reaction in people's faces. We can read body language, and we see how people respond to what we say. And we sort of see, okay, this is the perlocutionary effect on the listener. But in writing, you don't see that. And that, I think, that makes it even more exciting, because then readers can also bring in, their experiences into the text that they're reading.
During the pandemic as well, it's quite difficult because we do interact now through text mainly. So you don't really know. I mean, sometimes we just put he all the time because we wanted, the deadline is tomorrow. I would really appreciate that you get it to me right away, he, like that, right? It's just to actually make it a little bit softer, but you know that you're really pressed for time. But the thing is, you don't really know if people are actually laughing, or you don't know exactly what they felt or what they meant, because you can't see the nuances in the faces when they say it, right? So sometimes it feels a little bit terse, and there are also instances where you get just seen, they just saw your message, but there's no response. So you have this idea of like, hey, is she mad at me? Is she is she busy? I don't know exactly what's going on. So you have
digital laughter.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Digital laughter. Yeah. Continue. Yes.
Digital laughter is an interesting area of study in language studies. Some
really?
of our students.
I didn't know that that's even a word that you put together, digital laughter.
Yes, you can look at the way these words are used, he, ha, 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 and examine the contexts in which they are used to derive, meaning from how people are actually using them. And it's a very interesting area of study in language studies.
The icons too. I mean, I don't know if you guys find this weird in Facebook, like the angry icon, right? It's too angry, in my opinion. I mean, let's say somebody posts something, that you don't like, but you like the person, you just don't like the post, right? And you put an angry face. Are you angry? Are you angry at the person, or are you angry at the post? So you don't know, right? And I think it just feels like the communication. There's ambiguity in the communication, whether you're actually conveying anger to a person or to the content of the subject, right? And again, as well, the ambiguity of the face, like that angry icon is too angry, and it's like, it's like calling for a fight. I don't know
Yeah,
if
we
you
go
guys
back to intentionality.
yeah.
We go back to intentionality. What do you really want to do with that piece of language? Are you deliberately using ambiguity to express a certain idea because you don't really want the person to know how you're feeling, or is it in an inadvertent use of ambiguity? It
Yeah.
depends on what you really want the stretch of language, the utterance to perform. And this is Searle's great contribution to language studies. The notion of performativity, how we actually do things with words.
I might write to Facebook one time and tell them, hey, put more nuances in your icons. We need more icons. This is an answer from Paolo regarding news articles that use language deceptively. The example would be, he said, there was even an instance locally when one of our officials said, congratulations, Philippines, because we beat the virus, simply because we beat the UP prediction of researchers on status on the numbers. This was at the end of June 2020. If you all recall, what does beat mean exactly, and think about it now in November, did we beat the virus? So yeah, I mean, beating the UP predictions, I guess, instead of beating the UP virus. Sorry, the coronavirus, not the UP virus. This is from Jose Gan. This is what I'm talking about, ma'am. Even if we have varied concepts, we must not forget that people who are different from us have a right to be understood too, even respected by seeing them as they are.
Absolutely. Yes, totally agree. And
Yeah.
this is why I'm drawn into cross-linguistic studies and cross-linguistic semantics, because this is a way of having various perceptions and understanding why various languages may shape perceptions, and why we really need to think about how an idea is perceived. We just don't assume that they're all the same, that they're universal, because people use language. It's part of the fabric of our existence. So when we examine the way we use language, we also get to see, how people are different and how they're the same.
I think that's it. Do you have any more questions, guys? I hope we addressed your concerns as writers, and hopefully we have added value to your work, or to whatever masterpiece you're working on. No more questions. Maybe we can ask for final words from Jeena.
Well, thank you very much for joining us here today. And we do live in difficult times, and we hope that we find more ways of gaining understanding of each other. No matter how different we may be, there will always be things that make us the same, and we celebrate those things too. Have a great day.
Yep. So that's it for language, for invention and deception. I think to summarize, we actually discussed power of language. Our being careful about what we write. We only write truths, and we use deception only as a means to, to talk about truths. It should be all encapsulated in truths that we want to promote. According to the words of the guru, Persian poet Rumi, raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. So I would like to encourage everyone to keep writing truths, so that in the future we all get to understand each other, more, and we get to love each other more because we're more intimate and we know each other's truths. That's it for now, and thank you, NBDB. Any last words from NBDB?
Yes, thank you, Sir Frank, Miss Gina, for a very meaty discussion, and thank you for expressing your expertise and knowledge on this matter. I'm sure our viewers, our aspiring writers, have taken a lot from this discussion and this conversation. I know we understand, we see now how language really shapes our perception and how it is a really powerful tool in shaping our world, especially during these trying times where everyone is on the virtual realm right now. That's a really very meaty discussion. Thank you for that. So for everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for your time and really joining in this conversation entitled Invention and Deception. We also would like to thank Sir Paolo Manalo, who unfortunately cannot be online virtually, but we can see that we can communicate with him. So before we officially end, this is a kind reminder that for us to answer the evaluation form that will be emailed to you. And we have more exciting and informative sessions for you, especially this coming November 26th and 27th. That is Thursday and Friday next week. And I, I'm before we end, may I ask everyone to please turn your camera on for a photo documentation that we will have. I'll give you 10 seconds for that, for everyone to come join in this Zoom. Yes. Hello,
Page one.
everyone.
Page one first.
Okay. Everyone smile. One, two, three. Another set. One, two, three, smile. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate your questions. It shows that you are really interested in shaping the world and in really getting your stories and pieces out into this world. Thank you everyone. Please continue to follow the NBDB page and Books Philippines for YouTube. Hope you have a good day. Thank you everyone. Bye.